Hey everybody, and welcome to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. You're about to listen to part one of an episode that I did with Natalie Rousseau, who is my fellow witch, and we love to dive into supernatural stories. So our unofficial series is called Witches on Witches, and today we're doing Witches on Vampires and other supernatural things because we're talking about True Blood. There were a couple of things that came up in the conversation that I wanted to fill out a little bit. We jumped right into the conversation, and there was just so much that I ended up separating the conversation into two separate episodes. It's pretty much a continuous conversation, but you can just go ahead and listen to part two right away if you want to. So the first piece of context that I wanted to share is the era that we're looking at, because Natalie and I were thinking like, okay, what was happening in the world around this time? So the first season came out in 2008, and the show continued on until 2014. So that's the era that we're looking at. Natalie had also mentioned that she loved the first 5 seasons, and seasons 6 and 7 felt quite different to her. It turns out that the last 2 seasons were directed by somebody else. The first 5 seasons were Alan Ball, and then the last 2 seasons were Brian Buckner. Okay. I also wanted to share that I was quite delighted to find out that Anna Paquin, who plays Sookie Stackhouse, and Bill Moyer, who plays Vampire Bill, are together in real life, and I think they might have 2 kids together. So it's kind of sweet that they ended up together after all of this. So, you know, Sookie chose Bill after all, I suppose, as the story goes. I also wanted to introduce the series a little bit. If you're listening to this episode, you maybe loved True Blood back when it was on, right? So you might kind of forget some of it. So I'm just going to give a little overview. There are a few spoilers in this episode, but we're talking about 5 seasons plus, so there's sort of a lot to go through. We're not getting into too many details, but just to sort of spark your memory a little bit, we've got Sookie Stackhouse, and this show is based on the novels written by Charlaine Harris. There actually is a scene later in one of the series where Sookie's reading a book by Charlaine Harris. I thought was pretty great. So Sookie is this small town waitress in the small town of Bonton, and she's telepathic. So she has this ability to read people's minds, and she doesn't know why until maybe season 3 or 4, we start to learn why Sookie has this ability that nobody around her does. True Blood is this synthetic blood product that has been created in a lab by... The joke is that it's one of these famous scientists that turned out to be a vampire and just like kept doing his work. And so created this True Blood product that allowed vampires to come out of the coffin, is the word that they use for it. So we've got Vampire Bill, who returns to Bonton. His sort of family is from there. And we start with quite an interesting romance between Sookie and Vampire Bill. Then there's Eric Northman, who runs Fangtasia, which is a vampire bar in a nearby town. And he does that with Pam, who's one of the main characters. So they run Fangtasia. And at first, Eric and Pam are pretty villainous, but over time we start to kind of get closer to them and appreciate them and learn more about their backstories and so on. In season 1, it's a murder mystery that is resolved in quite an interesting way, I think, that maybe I won't say, just in case you, like me, wanted to rewatch the whole thing and couldn't remember any of it or have never seen it before. Season 2, we talk a fair amount about the maenad character, Marianne. And then we go on through these different mythological realms as we go on. So I also wanted to share just a couple of pieces that I really appreciated as someone who's been really steeped in mythology over the last year or so. I have a book called Maiden Warrior Mother Crone that just came out this year. And it's all about goddess mythology and divine feminine folklore. And so I have all of these specific stories that I've loved telling. And some of these characters actually show up in True Blood, which is quite delightful to see. One of them was Lilith, and I want to just give you a little bit of background on Lilith. So in the Bible, there are 2 origin stories, right? The first one says Then God created them, man and woman, he created them in his image, something like that. And then a few pages later, there's a different origin story, which is the one many of us know, which is that God created Eve out of Adam's rib, and so on. So the Hebrew mythology that's not directly in the Bible, but mythologically speaking, folklorically speaking, Adam's first wife was Lilith. So God created Adam and Lilith as his progeny, or their progeny, and that man and woman were both considered to be equal in God's eyes. The theory goes that Adam wanted to have power over Lilith, specifically by having sex missionary style, and she wanted to be on top, is kind of the mythology. But the way that I'm telling the story is she really understands that this is a world where the goddess is gone. There's much more to this story, and you can pick it up in my book, Maiden Warrior Mother Crone. But essentially she leaves the Garden of Eden because she's like, forget this. I don't want to be in a place where there's no goddess and there's no respect for women. So I'm out of here. And that creates a little bit of drama for God. And so God tries again, and he tries to create Eve as a more obedient helpmeet for Adam, which turns on him as well. And you get Eve's story later in that same book as well. So in the episode in the season that I've been watching right now, season 5, I'm just bouncing a little bit because I have a baby on my lap, in case you're wondering. Lilith shows up as a really important character. She is the god of the vampires. So there's like a secret vampire Bible that's all about Lilith as god and so on. And Salome, who is a mythological character from the Bible that I actually have tattooed on my side, huge tattoo of Salome that I got a long time ago because I loved Oscar Wilde's version of Salome's story. So in the story in the Bible, Salome is this young woman who is essentially so beautiful and so seductive that her stepfather, who is King Herod, offers her anything that she wants in exchange for a dance, right? The dance of the 7 veils, which is often reinterpreted as a striptease. So she dances for him, and he says, okay, what do you want? You can have anything. And she asks for St. John the Baptist's head on a platter. So she's one of these biblical villains, her and Jezebel, whose story I write about in the second in the series of these books that I've been writing, called Witch, Healer, Priestess, Outcast. That's coming out in November. Maybe snoring now, if you can hear that in the background. So I tell Jezebel's story in that book, and I'm a little obsessed with it. She's an incredible character that is so deeply connected to the earlier goddess mythologies that existed before the biblical history. So Salome is one of these characters who's seen as a villain, but if you kind of look into the story, what was actually happening is that Salome's mother had remarried. And at the time, there were actually a fair amount of rights for women, including the right to divorce. And if you divorced, you would have the right to property and money and things like that. So women had a fair amount of power. There was a movement at that time to sort of take women's power away. And one of the ways that happened was by outlawing divorce. And so John of the Baptist, who is this Christian saint, was speaking against Salome's mother, whose name was Herodias. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Herodias. And so he was basically trying to enact something that Herodias would have seen as oppressive, right? And so she and Salome together agree to take down John of the Baptist because he's a part of this sort of radical right. You can look at it that way, trying to take women's rights away, and Salome and Herodias were trying to fight against that. So I actually see Salome as a really powerful character, and she shows up in season 5 as a vampire, of course, and she tells her story correctly, right? She doesn't get super deep into the goddess mythology and the political importance of divorce, but I thought it was really interesting that she showed up and somebody had really researched like what her actual story was and who Salome is in the Bible. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that because we didn't get a chance to quite get into all of the mythology, and there's more, of course, in True Blood. But I wanted to add that as a little bit of context before you hear Natalie and I having this wonderful conversation. Last note before we get to it, the second in this series of this conversation is going to be published very soon, so don't forget to check that out when you get a chance. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Please enjoy this conversation with Natalie and I. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. And I'm very excited to have Natalie Rousseau back on the podcast. She's been a guest a couple of times, and I have deeply loved all of the conversations that we've had. I'm unofficially calling our shared series Witches on Witches or Witches on whatever. So we're going to do Witches on Vampires today because we're talking about True Blood. Yeah, it's an older show with 7 seasons, so it's a long one as well. And when you invited me to have this conversation, I was like, oh yeah, I think I watched that. I maybe watched half the first season, and so I've been really enjoying getting into it, and it's all new to me as well. So Natalie, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, I'm Natalie Rousseau. I live in British Columbia, Canada, and I work as a somatic therapist, but really I just think of myself as like the friendly neighborhood witch because I also love to work with medicinal herbs and tarot and astrology, and I'm a lover, like Julie, a lover of myth and story, and I just endlessly fascinated by the ways in which story, can speak to so much of the human experience and can help us to see sometimes what we don't see or what we haven't been able to put words to. And I love having these conversations with you, Julie.
Yeah, and I always forget to introduce myself because I always assume everyone knows who I am if they're listening to the podcast, which might be true. But I have these different elements of what I do, and one of the major ones is that I'm also a therapist with a somatic focus. And you and I are just so aligned in so many of the things that we do. I feel like we have a very similar perspective on what it means to be a witch, in terms of being someone who, one of my students actually expressed it as being a witch as someone who pays attention, right? It's sort of like someone who's just listening on a little bit of that deeper level, whether it's to the land, which is often a big part of it, is our connection to, the cycles of the moon, the seasons, those kinds of things, but also paying attention to the body, our emotions, our intuitions, our dreams, all of those things. It's sort of listening to, listening just beyond the veil, maybe. And you and I, we both read tarot, and you and I both have a bit of an obsession about mythology. And I keep thinking about how, I've been writing the series of books about mythology, goddess stories, folklore. And I keep thinking about how pop culture is essentially modern mythology, right? Like mythology used to be the stories that were brought from town to town, and these are the things that people would share on, and those stories would tell you something about that culture, right? What was important to them, what their values were, and so on. And pop culture does exactly the same thing. I think whether it's reality TV or True Blood is a sort of a fantasy book series. I guess it started that way, and then now it's this TV show that I think was extremely popular. I feel like everybody knows True Blood. It has a lot to say actually about who we are.
So I so agree with you that modern story and pop culture is a form of mythology, and that myth often helps us to know and understand the story of a people, how they experience themselves. And I feel that this series really shines a light on American culture, and particularly a culture in the American South. Now, of course, I'm not a citizen of the American South, so I can't say, that it's how true to form it is. But I think that's a great place to start, is that this show has this Southern Gothic theme, right? Done in a really kind of campy, fun. It's really gory at times, and it's really funny at times, and it's really poignant at times. It really it touches on so much, and I feel like one of the main characters is actually the setting, this little town of Bonton that's has that small town Americana feel with all these, everyone in the town, and the main characters, Sookie and Jason Stackhouse, they're raised by their grandma, who's the perfect grandma, and they have their lovely home. And so it's this, sweet little town where you think nothing bad could ever happen. And then everything happens.
Yeah.
Everything's there. Everything. that you can imagine. It's all
Yeah, and the show reminds me of Buffy the Vampire Slayer in a lot of ways too. It's sort of like a slightly more grown up Buffy, because she's sort of a young adult. She's not a teenager anymore. She's probably in her 20s, I guess, as the show goes on. But it has that same quality where I found Buffy would use a lot of these metaphors to explore, someone feeling invisible at school and they'd literally become invisible, and it would be, that would be the focus of that episode or whatever it is. And I find, it's a bit more grown up. There's definitely a lot more sex and violence. Well, Buffy was violent too, and sometimes gory, but a little more, PG maybe. I feel like the vampire of it all, which we've talked about before when we were talking about Anne Rice in a previous episode. And I have this thing about vampires. We did an episode on Nosferatu, and I have a baby nursing right now, which I can't help but think about this little tiny vampire sucking my blood and like what that means. There's a lot going on with the vampires, but I feel like actually the concept of vampires stands in for a lot of different things as the show goes on. Like it becomes a metaphor that shifts in and out of these different identities, and there are different ways that you can kind of read what it means to be a vampire.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And it's funny, I've been obsessed with vampires since I was young, and I feel like I've read or watched everything, but I've never watched Buffy, so I'm just going to name that now.
Oh.
It's actually a series I've never watched, so I'm going to add it to the list. But I am fascinated by this archetype of the vampire and all that it means and can mean. And I think that's one of the things, like often I think the vampire is this sort of shadow mirror for us, right? Like speaking to these hidden desires and kind of primal urges, and also this sort of like dark transformation. But yeah, there are then all these very different expressions of the vampire in this show. Some that fit our image, that is often, because often it seems that many show or series, books have shown the vampire. Sometimes they're terrifying, but often they're like very beautiful, right? Very beautiful,
Seductive.
very sexy, very seductive, very powerful, very wealthy often. Like, I don't know if it was like when that started coming in. But what I loved about this show is you just had these like everyday vampires, like someone that just looked like, you're like some middle-aged vampire, some like, was a vampire with a beer belly, like
Yes.
the really kind vampire and the really deranged vampire. There was every expression of vampire possible.
Absolutely. And I think one of the first expressions of the vampire as metaphor is racial tensions, probably in the American South, which I'm not, an American living in the South either. But, there is, I think, especially in the first season, such a sense of, we have been at war, for a very long time. And there's this movement away from segregation, right? It's sort of this idea that we've been segregated, we've been separated for all of this time. And some people have, in the mythology of the show, like people suspected that we existed maybe, and we came out of the coffin is the phrase they like to use. With another thing that I find is interesting is a technology, which is that someone became able to create true blood, which is the substance that vampires can drink so that they don't have to feed on human bodies, so they don't have to be violent anymore. And what a cool question of, if there's a species with this primal need that includes violence, and then there's a technology that can change that what happens next, right? And maybe we're thinking about lab meat and everything. I've gone off of the racial tensions here. This is a whole other metaphor. But I think what's interesting, especially in that first season, is just what you said, is that people have this idea of what a vampire is, right? And they talk about vampires as evil, as bad, whatever it is. And there's this, Nan Flanagan is this spokeswoman who's trying to kind of educate people that vampires are lots of different kinds of things. And, that just like any human group of people, there's a spectrum of different kinds of people that you can be. And even, I haven't watched the entire 7 seasons yet. I'm still in season 5, but I feel like throughout the whole show, there is this tension that keeps coming back, which is, who's good, who's evil, and how do we as human beings lean into our human evilness or not, because I think you see vampires being quite evil. You see some of them being quite good, but you always see humans doing the same as well. Like you see really evil humans, or humans that are ambiguous, right? Humans that are making bad choices coming from a good place or whatever it is. Like, I think there's a lot around how, as human beings, we often have this tribal way of being where we think, okay, it's us against them, and whoever the them is, we want to assume they're just one thing. But ultimately, anytime you get to know any group of people, whether it's based on race or sexuality or culture or any other thing, you find out, oh, there's lots of variation here, and I can connect in some ways, and that there becomes empathy after a while.
Yeah, and I feel like this show again just did such a neat job of using the supernatural theme, because you had all these different groups of supernatural beings, right? Here we're speaking about the vampires, but actually there's so many different types of supernatural beings that are brought out. Soups, exactly. So there's like shapeshifters and wares and witches and all this, and I feel like all of them tend to represent different, like, marginalized or othered communities, right? And so it speaks a lot to a lot of these themes of like classism and racism and marginalization, but using the allegory of supernatural beings so that we can in many ways like see it and receive it and contemplate it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I continue to appreciate as the show goes on, even in the very chaotic 5th season where they're trying to tell way too many stories and so on, there is at least one person on that show who is deeply researching the mythology of, fairies, the Tuatha De Danann, what a witch actually is. Like, I feel like the witch representation in that show is actually pretty close. Like, it's actually a pretty good representation of what a witch really is, which is a normal, usually woman who pays attention, and is engaging in ritual and things like that. It's not this kind of Baba Yaga kind of like, witch in the woods sort of terrifying older woman thing. It surprised me over and over again that, there was a moment when Lafayette, who's one of my favorite characters on the show, pulls some tarot cards and actually reads them correctly. I was like, oh, that is, you had like the correct interpretation of the Lover's card, which often people misinterpret. We do meet fairies at a certain point. Season 3 or 4, fairies start to come into it. And I love that, again, this mythology is correct. So the fairy mythology is something that I learned a little bit more about in my book when I wrote a chapter on Aravid for Witch Healer Priestess Outcast. But Aravid is part of the Tuatha De Danann, which I might be I find the Celtic names are really hard to pronounce, so forgive me if I'm doing that wrong. But basically this story is that the Tuatha De Danann were these supernatural kind of beings that appeared from the water into ancient Ireland, and they had all these skills and abilities, and Aravid became the goddess of herbalism. She's medically gifted. And there were all of these different fights that happened with different peoples in the land of Ireland. And the mythology is that the Tuatha De Danann, which became the fairy people, slipped into the other world, which is the place between worlds. You have to kind of go between the veil to access the other world. In the other world, time moves differently. If a human is taken to the fairy world and returned, they'll think it was one night, 20 years have passed by. This actually happens to a character in True Blood at a certain point. So the time dilation is really a true part of the Tuatha De Danann Irish mythology. I also loved that the fairies are a little ambiguous. Like they're not these kind of like, oh, sweet, pretty fairy things. There's a Halloween where one of the characters dresses as a fairy, and Sookie kind of, she startles when she sees this woman dressed as a fairy, and she says like, Sookie, why are you scared? Like, fairies aren't scary. And Sookie was like, you don't know what you're talking about. Fairies actually are quite scary. And that's true, right? They're powerful and they can be benevolent, but they can also be villainous. But, there's all this interesting mythology. That's what I'm writing about right now, is I'm doing a book about tarot and mythology, and that I'm sure you'll love. That's like right up your alley. But there's all this hidden stuff about how like the devil actually represents Dionysus, and the second season had all this stuff about the maenad and Dionysus and what that meant. And it's actually really quite correct. Like, as silly as the show often is, they're not messing around. When they're talking about mythology, they're really bringing forward like the real background of the mythology that they're exploring, which I continue to really appreciate.
Me too. And that's what I appreciate, was that it was almost like absurdist at times, because it could be really silly, really campy, but then it is speaking to these really strong themes socially and, within our own human psyche. And then also, yeah, I agree, well researched in terms of the mythology and these different races of supernatural beings. First of all, can we talk about the Maenad? Like,
yeah, of course.
That was fascinating. That was like one of the most compelling characters, I thought. This woman, Marianne, right? Marianne the Maenad, who comes in as like this, she's like a social worker, wasn't she?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's kind of what she said she was. Yeah.
Yeah, she's like, says she's a social worker, and she's there to, support one of the more unsupported characters, Tara Thornton, and help her out in a hard moment. And then it's just like this like mother figure. But then, increasingly you find out she just has these like really intense primal urges, which in many ways I'm like, yes, like celebrating, but then it just gets so dark. She was actually terrifying. Like, it was terrifying. And how everyone in the town, when they would get under her spell, they would have these like black eyes, and they just would be completely outside of themselves and just compelled by these really strong urges. I mean, just this, yeah, it was quite intense, right? They're just seeing how like the appetite's gone so far, too far.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe I'll ask you, because I feel like you probably know more about this than I do, but tell us a bit about a Maenad. Like, what is that mythologically?
I mean, from what I understand, right, like about the characters that were part of the cult of Dionysus, right, that they would go into these frenzies, right? They were these often women that would go into these states of ecstasis, so they would get outside of themselves, and then they were known when they were in that state to also be capable of great violence, and so would tear people apart. And so I'm of course really curious if originally, if that's like a story that then got told as a way of moving people away from the cult of Dionysus, or if that is part of the original mythology, knowing that there is a very fine line between, a state of celebration and ecstasy and then frenzy, right? Because it's true, right? I mean, I think Dionysus is the big part of that sort of concept, is that there's ecstasis, and then there's, you tip over into drunkenness, chaos, darkness, forms of darkness. And so, I felt that I was impressed with how they touched into that.
Yeah, I actually this morning was working on my devil chapter for this tarot book, and I actually have the devil as Pan, particularly in the story that I'm writing, but it's kind of a similar concept to Dionysus. Both of those gods were about sort of music and wildness, and connection to vegetation as well. Like, they were both vegetal gods, like related to the grapevines and so on. And a lot of the, not just Greek culture, but in other cultures as well, there often would be rituals oriented around losing your mind a little, right? You would be engaging with plant medicines or something like that. Wine was Dionysus's thing. And, in Tantra, that was that can be a big part of the ritual as well. And part of the lesson of that is stepping outside of the day-to-day so that you can connect with spirit, right? Which again is what a lot of modern witches do in these sort of smaller ways. Like, you're not necessarily consuming psychedelics, you might be, but even meditating, right? Even just taking a moment outside of your day-to-day life to be in a ritual. These are the moments where you can kind of move outside of all of the day-to-day stuff that keeps you bound, is the concept in the devil card, and the tarot has these two figures with chains. And the way I'm telling that story is that the devil is actually the one removing those chains. The devil is setting you free. But that's complex because we don't always want to be set free from our attachments, to our families, to like our day-to-day routines, like the things that keep us chained. can be both our best and our worst, right? And so the point of these rituals would often be to step outside so that you could shift your perspective, and then you step back in again, right? Like that's the idea, is that you would always kind of come back again to your day-to-day life, hopefully with a little bit more insight or whatever it is. And lest we think this is some sort of exotic, ancient culture thing, speaking in tongues, drinking the blood of Jesus in a church, like there are a lot of modern religious things from the Christian perspective that we don't necessarily think about it that way. But even like inhaling the incense, like being in prayer, like these are those same moments of stepping outside of our day-to-day so that we can connect with spirit, right? And there's a story about a sailor who in Roman times was out on the ocean, and he heard a disembodied voice saying, "Pan is dead." And what that meant, because the word pan also means everything, so the connotation was all pagan gods are dead because Jesus is born. So it was like this moment of, the Christian mythology is now going to take over from all of this pagan stuff, which is when we, many of us lost that connection to the land and nature and all of those things. And so to have the Dionysus or Pan be the devil in the tarot, which, as I'm learning more about the creators of the tarot and so on, like, yeah, they actually meant the devil to be an ambiguous figure. Like they meant the devil to be not this sort of evil guy, but somebody that would bring in temptation. And when you're reading with that card, you often want to ask questions about, for me, it's like, what's going on with addiction? What's going on with temptation? What's going on with stepping outside of like what's known, right? And also maybe what's going on with breaking the rules or resisting authority, or, connecting with those like quote unquote devil qualities that are things like pleasure and sexuality and all of these things that the dominant Christian culture has told us are not okay. So to bring it back to the show, right? I think Marianne, like, it was hard to see anything wrong with Marianne until quite later on. And even towards the end of that season when, the problem was she wanted to sacrifice one of the main characters because she thought that would help her sexually unite with Dionysus. And there was this interesting way that they were kind of resolving that around imagination and imagining yourself into being, and like the fact that she believes herself to be immortal makes her immortal, but if she can believe that there's a way that she can die, like if we can tell her this story essentially, then that would be how we can defeat her, is by giving her a story in which she can die, like by connecting with her god. And then that anyway, that it's a very, very interesting resolution, I think, to that story, but there's so much in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, there's so much about Marianne and the Maenad character that I love, because speaking to everything you just named, throughout time, so many of our ancient cultures have known the value of entering into altered states through ritual, through trance, through dance, through all of these means that we've always used, sometimes using intoxicants, sometimes just, through, like you said, through the smoke or the prayer or the song, through fasting. There's great value in entering into those states. And they also can be strange and terrifying. And there's a part of us that is terrified of those states and what they can awaken in us, what they can help us to realize, what we might see or feel, right? There's a safety often in maintaining the status quo. And I think, she had a really strong message there of that these things are important. And yet because of, I don't know, like, exactly what the writers were trying to say there, like about her, whether, again, she was ambiguous, which many pagan deities, if we can call them that, are ambiguous. It's not this clear good or bad, right? Because nature is ambiguous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nature is nurturing and it's terrifying. It's the whole full spectrum. And so it showed really that what can happen when we tip over into that place, where, yes, she wanted to sacrifice a member of the community, and also people who became part of her cult often, they lost themselves. They lost connection to their own values, to their own humanity, and they started becoming very violent and very their hungers were excessive, and they lost awareness of themselves in some very serious and terrifying ways. And that's something that scares a lot of us, I think, on a deep level, right? So I think that in a way, that character was a very ambiguous character, showing both the value and the danger of these states of intoxication, ecstasis, and
Yeah, and maybe we can talk about Tara a little bit more, because she's a really interesting character. I mean, they all are. But in the context of that season, we were really looking at Tara trying to maybe not necessarily get away from, but like resolve her relationship with her mother, right? And I'm pretty sure it was in that season. You and I know in our counseling practice, we both work with IFS a little bit. Inner children, different parts within the self, the ecosystem of selves, and so on. And there was a moment where Tara was trying to get the demon out of her, right? It was sort of like her mom was alcoholic and believed she had a demon in her, so she went to see sort of a folk healer, I guess maybe we would call, I forget her name. But she believed that the demon had been exorcised out of her, and that allowed her to become sober. We, of course, find out later that this folk healer was let's say she was also an employee at the local Walmart or whatever it was. And so did that mean she wasn't really a folk healer? The show doesn't totally land on whether it was 100% a scam or not, because in the end it worked, right? And I feel like so much of magic and healing is about that. And it's, again, that same concept of imagining ourselves into being really the key to how we are in the world, right? And whether those stories are literally true or not maybe matters less than how we perceive them on the inside, right? So anyway, there's a moment where Tara goes to the same folk healer, and she's trying to resolve this demon within herself, which she's not totally sure if that's a thing, but she's like, maybe, it worked for my mom. I'll see if it works for me. And there's this interesting scene where she meets a young child version of herself, and she has to kill the child version of herself. Do you remember that scene? And I'm sure you remember it because, as therapists, you and I would work with people encountering their child selves, and we don't kill them. we don't murder our child's selves. We befriend, we hug, we love, we ask them what they need, all of these things. Like, it's a very different healing process than trying to kill off a part of the self, right? And from an IFS perspective, that's very much the language around, the inner children often are exiled. We suppress them, we ignore them, we put them into the maybe the psychological other world, so that we don't have to face them. And yet they have power from beyond that veil. And the practice that we can do from an IFS perspective is really befriending and getting to know them, letting them be a part of our day-to-day lives, letting them grow up within us, and so on. And so, I think as we're watching Tara have this relationship with her mom, which is still ongoing and it's still unresolved in season 5. I don't know if it ever gets resolved in the show, probably not. There is such a feeling, and I have this feeling with clients sometimes where, maybe it would really benefit you to estrange yourself from this family member, and this is your family member that you love deeply, and that's always going to be true. And for a lot of people who have abusive family members, especially caregivers, it's just very complicated. You can't just cut that person out of your life. And maybe you should, and maybe there are times when you can, and so on. Sometimes that is the healing thing to do, but it's never uncomplicated to do that, right? And so anyway, what I was trying to say there is that Marianne really gives Tara this sense of, you can be your own person, you can have your own experiences. I'm going to give you a safe place to stay, and food, and all of the basic life's necessities that you need in order to kind of empower yourself, and then you can make your own choices. But then, of course, it gets complicated when maybe Tara does want to talk to her mom, maybe Tara does want to, help her out with something, and Marianne starts to get involved in this way where it's no, you're going to do it my way, right? Which, from a therapy perspective, of course, you want people to make their own decisions, not make them for them, right?
Yeah, I find Tara's character is so complex. And that theme, first of all, I think the show really addresses trauma in so many ways, so many forms of trauma, but a lot of relational and familial trauma. There are a number of characters that come from very complicated, complex families with parents that are abusive or neglectful in different ways, and shows how the characters, how they adapt to that, and how they live with that. And Tara's story is particularly, difficult, and there's a lot there. There's so many things I want to say about Tara. I love her strength. I think she's one of the strongest characters, and she's for sure one of like the more traumatized characters, and often is the one getting the most hurt by people and by different supernatural beings throughout the story. And she has a lot of anger. She has like a huge amount of anger that she really struggles with and is reckoning with. And I found that, really fascinating. And I'm really curious how other viewers have experienced that character. I'm particularly interested, as a white woman living in Canada, not, a Black woman living in the States. I'm really curious how those folks would experience that character, because I'm curious about this kind of like angry Black woman trope that she exemplified. It's I don't know, these are some thoughts that are just like I'm wondering how she was received by others. But I loved that character, and I was curious what it would be like if she hadn't been so angry and traumatized.
I think it does feel really clear where the anger comes from.
Absolutely.
And I think she's also really likable in a way that she tells people what's up. And a lot of the time what she gets angry at is people saying racist things to her, right? And she will talk back in a way that maybe as a white woman with a waspy family where, we tend to not say anything, it's quite delightful to see the way that Tara tells the truth a lot of the time and insists on people telling her the truth. Yeah. And she's also so vulnerable in so many different ways. I think you do see her getting hurt a lot of the time, including by Marianne, sort of being used by Marianne. And, I will say, so, I hope we don't need to worry about spoilers, because this is quite an older show. Yeah. But towards the end, I think it's that second season, Tara falls in love with Eggs, who's this beautiful Black man who is a part of Marianne's cult without knowing that. And it turns out that he's been used by her in many cases to kill people because he's strong, right? Like she kind of uses him as her brute strength, which is a way that Black bodies have been used, right? In many different ways. He's not consciously aware that this is happening. And eventually he does find out what's happened, and he's sort of devastated by that and confused by that. And then there's a police violence moment, right, where he's actually shot by I think it's Andy, right, who later becomes the sheriff, because he's like too freaked out, and like his kind of gun goes off in this way that police violence against Black people will often has happened in the States, where there's an internalized racism of the often but not always white police person, which Resmaa Menakem, how does he refer to it? It's like a police body or something like that. So there's white bodies and there's Black bodies and different kinds of bodies, but a police body is like its own entity. So it doesn't really matter so much what your race is, because you're within this institution and you're being used within this institutional perspective. And that institution has so much internalized racism that the hair trigger literally on whoever is in the police body will tend to be against Black bodies in particular, even Black children in some cases. And so, it was maybe this moment where Tara had an opportunity to have this like beautiful Black love story and like have this connection with this man who could be healing with her and all these things, but then he's actually killed off. And so I feel like they're speaking to these really interesting racial concepts, but then it's a cliche that it ends up happening, right? Is that she, this one, Black love that she has doesn't get to move on into the next season, which I was quite upset by, because I really loved Eggs and I wanted more of him, right?
Yes to all of that, exactly. And like, yes, her rage made so much sense, because exactly they were showing all of these maybe stereotypical themes, right? And I think we all love that she was such a fighter all the way through. She would exactly that. She would fight for herself. She would stand up for herself. She would stand up against oppression in all the ways that it would show up, and she would fight for others. I mean, she would put her own life on the line for her friends. It just was it was challenging. Her story is challenging all the way through, that she is, for all her ferocity and what a survivor she is, how vulnerable she was so much of the time, and how much loss and impact she received in the story.
Yeah, there's also a storyline in one of the later seasons where she is sexually violated in a way that I think is, it was by a vampire, which is, again, vampire as metaphor for sexual predator. That's one of the metaphors for sure that's being used. And it happens in this interesting way where they start with a consensual sexual connection, and then it evolves into sort of a domestic violence situation. And she needs to be sexually available to this person in order to survive that situation. It's very gory, it's very extreme, it's very campy, but that's how it goes a lot of the time, right? Is that it can start consensual, and then, certain things start to happen. There's sort of grooming and love bombing and all of that stuff that can be very confusing for a person. And then often people, often a woman, but not always, will be needing to use her sexuality in order to escape a dangerous situation. And then you see a pretty realistic depiction of PTSD from Tara's perspective, the flashbacks, the somatic symptoms that come up, how it's not totally resolved when her perpetrator is killed eventually. I think it's actually, that was a pretty effective way of showing what PTSD can look like, right?
I agree. Yeah, that was really, really well done. And again, really, really edgy and really, really revealing. And just the confusion, her abuser being like, but I love you. It's all about acting like these passionate declarations of love being displayed in ways that are just straight up abusive, and how terrified she was. It really showed her terror. And then what she had to do in order to escape that. Yeah. And how, she didn't really escape because the impact of that experience was long lasting.
Yeah. And I think there was a moment too where, if I remember correctly, I think it's Jason who eventually kills her perpetrator. And then he might say something, it's over now, it's okay now, it's resolved, right? And she's just standing there shaking, terrified, that's not better. That doesn't, seeing him killed in front of me actually didn't resolve my PTSD about the situation. It's piling violence on violence. That doesn't actually solve anything, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it really showed the way trauma continues to echo in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's shown from that cultural perspective too, against the humans against the vampires, and the conversation that they continue having about should we be connected to each other? Are we related? Are humans our ancestors, or are they our food, right? Are vampires these freak anomalies, or are they a natural part of the world that we live in? That conversation keeps happening over and over and over again in different ways, which I think is really interesting too. Thanks for listening to part 1 of this conversation that I had with Natalie Rousseau on True Blood. If you enjoyed that, please tune in for part 2, where Natalie and I just continue our conversation and we talk a little bit more about the relationships in the show. So I hope you enjoyed that. There's more to come. Don't forget to check out the archive of episodes for shows that you might have loved, that you want to think about a little bit with us. And don't forget that you can tip me if you want to support the show. Go to juliepeters.ca/tip me. If you send me $50 or above, I will quite happily send you a personal tarot reading just from me to you, and you can send me a question if you want to. So stay tuned for more, and I will catch up with you next time.